By the mid-90s, the shift from 2D games to 3D was unavoidably in full swing, and game developers found themselves at a crossroads, especially those working on games for consoles. On one hand, they could stick with what they knew and continue making 2D games. After all, this new generation of consoles gave them more than enough headroom to cram as much high-quality voice acting, music, and complex level designs into their games as they wanted, and that could really bring their 2D games into a newer, more mature era, like we saw with Castlevania Symphony of the Night. But on the other hand, developers could also use that exciting new tech to venture into the unknown, dance on the wild side, and go full 3D with polygons. Early 3D polygonal games were impressive looking to consumers and were starting to sell really well. But developing 3D games contained lots of unknown quantities. Developers had to learn the ins and outs of new engines, texture mapping, and still make sure that everything came together and played well enough to be fun. And as we now know, this era of early 3D games would yield results all across the spectrum for every genre. I mean, we got everything from Metal Gear Solid to Mort the Chicken.
What the heck is that?
So the ceiling for 3D games was really high, but the floor could also be really low, so it's kind of high risk, high reward. And developers were caught in the middle of this very uniquely pivotal, kind of risky moment in game development history, and they had to make a decision. And those decisions would be really impactful for games in every genre, including the arcade-style shoot-'em-up, or shmup. Now when I say shmups, I'm basically just referring to the games that most people refer to when they say it. I'm talking about shoot-'em-ups that are strictly 2D and their gameplay usually revolve around some kind of spaceship or something, and you're blowing away enemies while some sort of level scrolls behind you. That, to me, is a shmup. I know there's all kinds of other types of shooters you could call shoot-'em-ups, and I guess you could logically call them shmups, but that's not what I'm talking about here.
No, no, no!
So that's my qualifier. That's what a shmup is, at least for the purposes of this conversation. I have a cat. R-Type Delta is a great example of 3D visuals done well in a side-scrolling shooter, so let's start with that. At first, a 3D R-Type game might throw you off.
How is that possible?
It's not.
But despite breaking the laws of the universe, Irem took that 3D plunge, at least in terms of presentation, with R-Type, and overall, I think it worked out pretty well. Unlike some earlier attempts at this sort of thing, R-Type Delta actually embraces the new dimension with swooping camera angles and lots of depth in the background. It looks cool and makes the game at least appear to be a real evolution of the series, with only a handful of 2D sprites here and there, like with water splashing effects and a couple other things. That said, most of the game's 3D aspects are entirely cosmetic in nature. Rarely is depth ever used in any way to shake up the actual gameplay. You still move in 2 dimensions, and rarely does the level layout ever take you into those 3D spaces in the background. Enemies come in from the background, and those backgrounds definitely look cool, but again, you never really interact with them in any functional way, until they're right in front of you. So it's a very conservative step. Regardless of how 2D or 3D it comes off though, R-Type Delta wears its new polygonal getup pretty well, and most importantly, it's a fantastic shooter with good enemy variety and distinct levels, with different motifs that don't just recreate things we saw in the previous R-Type games. Although it does do some of that. Delta's enemy variety is quite good, with very few enemies repeating, although many of them are just 3D versions of what we saw in the original game, which is fine, as that does make the game feel like part of the series and not like too much of an offshoot. In my opinion, the music isn't great though. It's certainly better than the corny remixed music of Super R-Type on the TurboGrafx CD, but not by a whole lot. And it's nowhere near as good as the original game's music. There are some cool effects here and there though, like the audio mix changing when you go underwater, which is pretty neat. The sound effects are cool and convey some nice impact with explosions and boss deaths, so at least we're good there. Overall, R-Type Delta is another great R-Type game. It takes advantage of the newfangled 3D space by giving the levels some nice visual depth, despite largely shying away from doing much else with it. Perhaps that's for the best, though. Sometimes it's hard to judge old franchises when they do something new because I don't want the same thing over and over again for decades on end, but I also don't want a sequel to stray too far from its identity, so I guess with that in mind, Delta has a respectable mix of new and old, even though not all of it works. It's got what matters most, with familiar R-Type-y weapons, stern challenge, and a few tweaks to the combat like the dose gauge that unleashes a powerful attack when charged, and of course the iconic launchable pod that's just as fun and versatile as it's always been. Several stages actually seem specifically designed to test your ability to use it too, so this certainly feels like a worthy R-Type game all things considered, and a respectable step into the polygonal future. Not all shmups that experimented with 3D worked out so well though. Enter Sylphid on the Sega CD. This game took a big swing at making a shmup entirely out of 3D polygons in 1993, and, well, they certainly tried. Here we actually have a mix of real polygons in the foreground and what is clearly an FMV of polygonal levels scrolling past you in the background. It's basically the same idea as the many FMV rail shooters of the time, but just modified a little bit to work as a spaceship shoot-'em-up instead, which is a neat idea and certainly gets around the limitations of the Sega CD to some extent. It can be a little jarring though, since the background FMV is running at a lower frame rate than the real foreground objects are. This is easier to overlook in some stages than others. For instance, it's not super noticeable in the first couple of stages, where the background is mostly just stars and the occasional asteroid scrolling by, but later on, when the backgrounds become more elaborate and actually need to be focused on to avoid hazards, the idea starts to fall apart. It can be tough to tell what objects in the background pose a hazard and which don't, especially in this asteroid level, where some of them are just part of the background FMV, and some of them are actual asteroids that will hurt you if you touch them. You can tell if something is real or not by seeing if it reacts to your fire, and if you pay real close attention to the frame rate difference, but that's not particularly good game design, is it? I should be able to immediately tell the background from the foreground just by looking at it, which is Shmup Level Design 101. The polygons that the game uses are extremely basic and might not be to everyone's taste. Most surfaces don't even have any texture at all, and just consist of one color and a very rudimentary shading when they rotate. It works to convey a sense of 3D, but again, the simplicity works against it in terms of staying engaging. There's just not a lot to look at most of the time. Later levels keep things a little more interesting, but they all suffer from some degree of repetition, with the same couple of design concepts just getting repeated to the point of exhaustion. Another thing to note is that the whole game is on a tilted field, putting the entire thing at sort of a slight angle, and this is something I actually grew to like once I got used to it. It doesn't really add too much to the gameplay per se, but it does set the game apart visually and it looks cool. I guess you could argue it lets you see further ahead than a more straight-up angle would have though, so perhaps it does add a little something.
Just look at it.
As you get further, your weapon selection and options grow, but none of them are particularly distinct or fun to use in my opinion. It's all extremely basic stuff here, which extends to the enemies, the power-ups, and the bosses. Many of the enemies repeat, and even the ones that don't still have similar behaviors and firing patterns. And unfortunately, the sound doesn't fare much better. Sound effects are decent, but don't really have much of an impact, and the music is, well, it's certainly energetic, I'll give it that. There's also a lot of voices in the game that can sometimes add a little bit of something by warning you of incoming threats. Overall, it's pretty obvious that 90% of the reason this game exists was to look flashy and sell Sega CDs. It's very much a product of its time, and that time is a very short window between the end of the 16-bit generation and the beginning of the 32-bit generation. Despite that, I think it clearly had at least a small role in opening the floodgates for other 2.5D and 3D shmups to succeed later on. Sylphied was a canary in the coal mine of sorts, and showed developers what could work in a game like this, as well as a bunch of stuff to not do. It was one of the first games off the boat in the D-Day of shmups storming the beaches of polygonal Normandy. So, even though I don't really like it, I salute it. Raystorm is the sequel to the 2D Ray Force, aka Layer Section, aka Galactic Attack, aka Gunlock. Don't ask, I don't know. Ray Force was a pretty cool 2D shmup that was a huge hit in the arcades of 1995, thanks in part to the great graphics that had a lot of 3D adjacent effects, and a rather unique lock-on laser that you could use to do extra damage and hit targets that were out of range. Chaining together multiple targets would also net you a higher score, so there was kind of an addictive component to it. For the sequel, however, Taito wanted to get ahead of the coming 3D revolution with a follow-up that played more or less like the last game, but would feature more 3D visuals and convey more depth between flying and grounded enemies. Raystorm did just that when it released in arcades the following year, and again, garnered a fair amount of success for Taito. Raystorm would find its way to the PS1 and Sega Saturn in 1997, where it would run similarly on both, but a little better on the PS1. The trademark lock-on function from the first game translates over to Raystorm perfectly. Here though, I actually like the use of it a little bit better. You got two different ships to choose from that both deploy different types of fire but largely play the same. You can also make the lock-on function automatically fire upon finding a target, which I think I prefer, even though it might make things feel a little bit easier than they're supposed to. Still, with action as chaotic as it often is in Raystorm, it can be nice to just rest your thumb on the fire button and let the lock-on cannon do its thing. The 3D graphics don't go nuts with changing camera angles or having you fly in strange directions too much, but there are a few moments here and there where Raystorm seems to have a little bit of fun with the new dimension and shows off some nice visuals, albeit most of the level designs are a bit more on the cliché side. Some levels stand out really nicely while others are just kind of average, but overall it's a good-looking game. Raystorm seems content to let the gameplay do the talking, and that's not a bad strategy. Now, the third game in the series, Ray Crisis, would come along in 2000 and deliver much better graphics all around, as well as improved level and enemy variety. It also made a few tweaks to the general gameplay that made it more fun to play, at least in my opinion. And it's easily the best game in the trilogy, but by this time, players had been exposed to so many more revolutionary games that Ray Crisis actually sold and reviewed worse than Raystorm, despite being objectively better, and one of the better shoot-'em-ups of that generation. Ah well. Back to the mid-90s and we have G Darius. Now, I've always enjoyed the Darius games, though for some reason I haven't gotten around to playing most of them. Clearly I'm in the minority on that though, since this series has remained one of the most popular and accessible shoot-'em-up franchises, with multiple ports and collections popping up pretty consistently since it first emerged in arcades in 1987. G Darius seems like kind of a red-headed stepchild of the series though, which I can only surmise is because of the early 3D polygons. I gotta say though, this game handles that style better than most, while also making some clever tweaks to the Darius formula that it really stands out, at least to me. This might actually be my favorite Darius game I've played, though like I said, I haven't played them all. Like R-Type Delta, G Darius does its best to embrace the jump to 3D visuals. You get lots of enemies zooming in and out of the frame, and some experimentation with different camera angles. G Darius pushes the envelope further than R-Type Delta though, and does a better job of feeling like a real evolution, at least in my view. Some levels have you circling around mountaintops, certain sections change your direction of fire on a whim, and several of the boss battles have you zooming all around the screen while the boss flips around and attacks you from different angles. It's quite a wild ride, honestly, and I think it works extremely well. Although sometimes it's not immediately clear what side of the screen the game expects you to be on, and you might take a hit or two until you figure it out. These moments are few and far between though. Actually, in general, G-Darius does an above-average job of handling contrast between the background and the foreground so that your eyes naturally just kind of rest where they're supposed to, which is all the more impressive when you consider how much craziness is going on in the background so much of the time. And even though there are some big changes here, it still feels like a Darius game with the simultaneous bomb and projectile fire combo, and the massive alien robot fish monster boss battles, along with the diverging level paths, and some other design cues that feel unique to this series. The shooting is solid here, although the weapons themselves are a little on the bland side. My favorite thing they've added though is the capture balls, which you use to literally capture enemies and make them fight on your side until you either die or get rid of them. It seems like you can capture the vast majority of them, even mid-bosses, after you wear them down a bit. They all do different things too, like locking into place to give you more spread or turning into little Gradius-style options. And some turn into shields that can take several hits on your behalf. This really mixes up the game nicely, and I'm surprised I haven't seen this idea used in anything else that I can think of. It's really fun to see what different enemies do when captured, and many of them can drastically change the way you play through any given stage. Plus, if you ever get tired of one, you can always turn them into a massive devastating beam that obliterates everything in your path for a few seconds, and can even make short work of bosses. Functionally, this is still a 2D game, but the wild nature of the levels, zooming all around real 3D spaces, bosses and enemies flying all around the Z-axis, and even your ship changing directions relatively often, really pushes that categorization to its limits. The textures aren't the most detailed for the time, but they look bright and colorful while keeping the game running pretty smooth. So I'll take it. I can definitely see how this was impressive in 1997. Hell, I'm impressed by it now. The only thing that doesn't look too great are the 2D explosions, of which there's only a few different types. And I don't know, they just look kind of cheap on top of everything else. Not a huge deal, of course, and the game is too much fun to get hung up on that. If you can't get past the low-res PS1 graphics for some reason though, I recommend picking up G-Darius HD, which has 5 versions of the game. 2 of which feature much cleaner-looking high-res visuals that are easier on the eyes, although for some reason these versions of the game seem to run worse, with occasional slowdown in places that the original version of the game does not have, so that's dumb. But even that original version is included on this anyway, so even if you do prefer the OG, this is the way to go. It's also much cheaper than getting the original PS1 version, at least as of the making of this video. I got it for 20 bucks. Either way though, you can't go wrong with G-Darius. It uses 3D graphics extremely well, puts a couple fun twists on the format, and still delivers that fun, chaotic shooting and vaguely fish-themed enemy roster that only a Darius game can. About a year after Ray's Storm released, Sega Saturn owners got their hands on Thunder Force 5 Perfect System, which was ported to the PlayStation about a year after that. The Thunder Force series contains some of my favorite shoot-'em-ups of all time, namely Thunder Force 3 and 4, or as we know that one in the States, Lightning Force. These games are known for their challenge, and Thunder Force 5 is hell-bent on maintaining that reputation. It does not care about you at all, and I absolutely suck at it. Technosoft also felt the need to go the 3D route with their flagship shooter series here, but unlike R-Type Delta or G-Darius, Thunder Force 5 doesn't make as graceful a transition. The graphics here are serviceable, but they're not very appealing most of the time. I mean, look at Thunder Force 3, and look at Thunder Force 4. Now look at Thunder Force 5.
What the fuck?
Okay, it's not horrible looking, but it doesn't look particularly good, does it? Feel free to compare these visuals to any of the other games in this video. Even Sylpheed, as boring as that one is to look at, it's not nearly as dreary and unappetizing as Thunder Force 5 often is. So yeah, the results are a bit mixed this time around. The mix of polygons and sprites in both the foreground and the background make this game as a whole look a little bit cheap and unfocused, while the color palettes for many of the levels just aren't very interesting. which again stands in direct contrast with previous games in the series. It's almost as if the folks at Technosoft felt forced to go with 3D visuals. Like they just did it reluctantly as opposed to fully embracing the style and having fun with it like R-Type Delta or G Darius. To be clear, it's not a horrible looking game, it just feels kind of uninspired and overall below average. Gameplay-wise, I don't hate it. It doesn't feel broken or unfair. Like I said, it is extremely difficult though. This is easily one of the hardest shmups I've ever played in my entire life, and that's not due to bad design or anything. Enemy fire and other foreground objects pop off in the background just fine, your weapons all feel well balanced, and like they could potentially get you through any situation, it's just freaking hard. Your main ship is nice and small, which might be in part to hide the way it looks, but that does give you just a little bit more room to operate, of which you will be needing every last bit. You can change weapons while the game is paused though, which is nice, and that's about the only thing even remotely resembling an olive branch you're gonna get, so take advantage of it. The soundtrack here is excellent. It's fast, it's energetic, and it's epic, which matches the gameplay pretty well. Kinda reminds me of what we got from Ginga Fukai Densetsu Sapphire, which is a logical evolution from the music in Thunder Force 3 and 4. I like the new version of the Game Over song in particular, which is good since I hear it a lot. So yeah, I can recommend Thunder Force 5, as it's certainly not a bad game, and while the graphics aren't particularly good, there are some cool-looking sections here and there. That said, my recommendation only applies if you are a huge fan of the series or the genre, and just want to experience everything from this era. Also, it helps if you're a bit of a masochist. Gunbear Game Tengoku 2 takes things in an entirely different direction, and a similar one to that of the Star Parodier and Parodius games, in that it's clearly more of a Q-em-up style shooter, and also revels in parody of other games and genres.
Point up!
This is actually a sequel to a game called The Game Paradise Master of Shooting that came out a few years prior, and while that one had a little bit of fun with FMV backgrounds and real-time scaling effects, it still mostly dealt with 2D elements. This one goes almost entirely in on polygons though, and I think it benefits from that. Something about these bright, colorful polygons really elevates the Q-em-up style. I'm not sure what it is, but it works. You have several characters to choose from, each with their own firing patterns, default speed, and power levels, and even their own style of crosshair. Each one is fun to play, but some are certainly more advantageous than others. It's not perfectly well balanced. Now, there is supposedly a store in the game where you can buy upgrades and stuff, but I wasn't able to find it. I'm just glad I was able to get to the level select screen. Stages are all distinct and themed around gaming in some way, like the first one here being a giant arcade where different games and cabinets are attacking you for some reason. And this one where you take on Vectrex-style wireframe enemies in space. Level variety is on point, even though the levels themselves might overstay their welcome by just a tad. Shooting is perfectly serviceable, if not maybe a little bit bland. You have your basic shot, which is different for each character, and a lock-on, kinda like Raystorm, which I think is probably the target of many of this game's references. And a bomb attack, which is again unique to each character, and some of these are more useful than others. Like the little pig dude's bomb being absolutely devastating, and this girl's bomb being just kind of a random splotchy assortment of explosions that don't deal a whole lot of damage. The game is definitely fun to play though. The humor gets you through, even though I'm pretty sure most of the jokes and references are probably going over my head. I can still appreciate the humor in a general way though, like this part, which seems to be a parody of some kind of horror game or maybe a spooky visual novel. But then it turns into a battle with an evil Tamagotchi, so I'm on board. It's kind of hard to level serious critiques against a game that so clearly does not take itself seriously to begin with, but if I had to come up with something, I guess I would just say that the shooting itself could have used something in the way of more weapon types, or a better version of the rather slow lock-on function to keep it a little bit spicier. Is this on the level of legendary Q-em-ups like Star Parodier or Fantasy Zone? No, but overall you might actually be surprised with how good it is. It's funny, and it has a lot of fun with its 3D environments and changing camera angles, even though some of them don't make a lot of sense. And with how goofy it all is, it's pretty easy to have good enemy and boss variety throughout its handful of stages. So if you're into imports and you don't mind a little bit of Japanese text, I think it's worth a try. Not to be totally left out, the Nintendo 64 would see a small handful of classic-style shmups. Most of them wouldn't make it out of Japan, but a couple did, and one such game was Star Soldier Vanishing Earth. Hudson Soft decided to join Irem, Taito, and others by taking their flagship IP into the third dimension, and the results were resoundingly alright. Being the follow-up to Soldier Blade, which is one of the best shoot-'em-ups of all time, created some mighty big shoes to fill here. And while I don't think Vanishing Earth lives up to that, it's not bad. In fact, it's pretty decent. Here, Hudson flips the script a little bit by giving you 3 different ships to choose from at the beginning and between continues, each having a few different stats, but the biggest difference between them is their firing style. You have the red spread shot, blue lasers, and green waves, which, yes, is the exact same arsenal from Soldier Blade. Although here you don't get to switch between them, as they're tied to the ship that you selected, which is an inferior system in my opinion. I'd much rather just have one ship and be able to switch around to different weapons. Not sure why they went this route. But you do have 2 special attacks now, which is definitely an upgrade. Each ship has their own screen-clearing bomb and more focused special attack that does a ton of damage to whatever you aim it at. You get a fair amount of these, but as always I recommend saving them for the boss battles, which are notably more difficult than the levels themselves.
Mission clear.
The 3D graphics look pretty good. A lot of the textures are a bit on the muddy side, which is common for N64 games, but it's not too bad here. In fact, given the amount of enemies and activity on screen so much of the time, I'd say this is an above-average looking N64 game. Although some enemy fire can bleed into the background a bit more than I would have liked. They really could have handled the colors a little bit better in some sections to provide more contrast. The music, though, is pretty damn good. It avoids the techno bleeps and blorps that almost every other shoot-'em-up was doing at the time, and opts for a slightly modernized version of the music from previous games. It's not nearly as memorable of a soundtrack as the ones we got in older Hudson Soft games, but again, it's pretty good. The MIDI-style N64 music can definitely surprise me sometimes. Not too much else to say about this one. It's pretty average and simple all in all. It's worth a play if you're a fan of the genre, and it does provide some fun challenge and solid entertainment. Just don't expect much more than that.
Mission clear.
Einhander is awesome. Unlike every other game on this list, Einhander stands alone, with no sequels or prequels before or since its release in 1998. And that's kind of insane, because it's one of the better shooters ever made, let alone with 3D visuals. It doesn't get a whole lot better than this, 2D or 3D. Hell, I'd say this game transcends the entire genre. This is one of those games that everybody needs to play. Period. End of story. End of review, in fact. Nah, not really. As anybody who has played this game will gladly tell you, Einhander is an outstanding shooter that gets just about everything right. The plot revolves around a war between Earth and the Moon, where you play a kamikaze fighter sent from the Moon's side of the war to cause as much death and destruction as possible on Earth, but later in the game, the lone pilot grows a conscience and decides to end the war himself by turning on his own side. Pretty neat idea for a shooter, and while it's a fairly minimal story that mostly takes a backseat to the action, I rather enjoy it. The graphics here are basically entirely 3D polygons, and they look outstanding, and not just in terms of detail, although the detail is rather good for the time. But the game mostly looks great because of the clear dedication to its war-torn, futuristic cybernetic art direction. It's like Blade Runner combined with more Blade Runner. And maybe a dash of anime. Especially that first level, which is absolutely incredible. Einhander's various cityscapes, skylines, and underground military facilities all absolutely bleed the game's militarized dystopia vibes all over the screen. No bombs or super attacks or anything like that here. Einhander opts instead for a modular weapon system that has you switching out different attachable guns you acquire from enemies and going back and forth between them. Each weapon can be swapped from the top to the bottom slot, where some of them actually perform different functions. Like the spread shot here actually shoots behind you when it's on top, or in front when it's on the bottom. So mastering these different weapons and learning when to switch them around is the key to the game. Which means, yeah, some trial and error is involved, but Einhander has so much personality and is so fun to play, you likely won't mind that you're repeating the same sections multiple times. Einhander uses its polygonal style in a similar way that R-Type Delta does. Squaresoft gives the levels great depth and makes enemies fly in from the background and the foreground fairly often, but it doesn't go as crazy with it as G-Darius. So as usual with these games, you can't hit enemies until they're in your 2D plane, but the Wasp Seeker missiles can sort of cheat around that a little bit. So again, mastery of the weapons is crucial. Some of the diagonal camera angles are a bit sharp at times, and by that I mean it just kind of throws your brain off with the controls and can lead to the occasional accidental death, but these moments are few and far between. The unique designs of the enemies and even your own ship feel like they actually belong in a polygonal game though, as do the game's levels. I genuinely can't imagine this game being 2D, it feels totally organic to this art style. Now the music does go in a similar electronica direction as a lot of other 3D shmups did, but here it's done with a little bit more of a Euro flair to it, kinda like what you might hear in the earlier Wipeout games. It also reminds me of the original Tekken soundtrack a little bit, this boss theme in particular. This isn't really my type of music, but you can't deny the awesomeness of that. It's crazy that Einhander never got a sequel, and even crazier that it came from Squaresoft, who had no real experience in developing shoot-'em-up games at all, and yet managed to pump out one of the best ones ever made. Kinda reminds me of how Criterion made one of the best first-person shooters of all time with Black, even though they had never made one of those. Sometimes developers can just do that, I guess. Einhander commands quite a price tag these days, but this is a rare occasion where I feel like it's probably worth it. The game has so much style and stays so fun to play despite how difficult it gets, and that's a rare set of qualities. Later levels do have some borderline insanely difficult sections, but the difficulty curve is pretty fair throughout, so with a little bit of practice and a dash of luck, most players can probably make it to the end. And what an end it is, with the final boss being an absolute marathon. I literally had to take a nap after getting this footage. Einhander is a 10 out of 10. It's an absolute triumph of a game. And yeah, I recommend it, in case that wasn't already clear. So by the end of the millennium, it was pretty clear that 3D graphics just weren't enough to keep this genre relevant and have it compete in a meaningful way. I mean, all the razzle-dazzle from Tomb Raider and Siphon Filter and Spyro the Dragon, stuff like that, shmups just weren't gonna really compete with that long term. I think I agree that 2D sprite work has definitely aged better, but I don't know, I just find these early polygons just really charming in their own kind of weird way. So I'll be talking about games from this era a lot more going forward. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.